Hello, my name is Daniel Schoonmaker. I'm the Executive Director of West Michigan Sustainable Business Forum, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our event today. Our April forum is on solutions for regenerative capitalism with John Elkington. For those who are not familiar with our organization, West Michigan Sustainable Business Forum, which is today doing business as the Michigan Sustainable Business Forum, it is the forum's statewide program comprised of business institutions that collaborate to promote sustainable business practices that advance climate leadership, social justice, community resilience, and the creation of a circular economy. Our next events are on April 19th, our April forum will be leveraging design thinking as a strategy for sustainability, featuring Further Degree. And that'll be on April 19th from noon to 1 with a half-hour networking session to follow. And you can find a registration link for that presently in your chat box. Please keep an eye out in our newsletter and event emails and take a look at other upcoming events on our website as those are scheduled. Video of today's program and prior sessions from our online series are available on demand at no cost on West Michigan Sustainable Business Forum's YouTube channel. After this event, you will also receive an email with a link to that video, as well as a feedback survey and any additional notes that may come out of today's program that we would like to share with you. All of the forum's programs are primarily funded through membership donations. If you're not yet a member of our organization, I'd strongly encourage you to become one. There's really never been a better time to do so or a greater need than today. A link to more information about our membership can be found in the chat shortly. To that effect, I'd like to recognize our new corporate members, Impact Collective Group, Fruit Belt Tart Sparkling Tonic, West Michigan Solar LLC, and Irwin Seating Company. I'd also like to welcome two new individual members, Kate DeVries and Kushan Shah. Following this event, we're happy to welcome you to a virtual networking session, a separate breakout room to meet more of our members. The link will be posted in the chat shortly, as well as at the end of the event. You may also be interested in learning about our various working groups, including our Sustainability and Equity Working Group, our Climate Leadership Working Group, as well as our regional programs at Lakeshore and Southwest Michigan, which may be of interest to some of you tuning in today. Please email us to get involved with any of these groups and initiatives. Now I'd like to introduce our featured guest today, our guest of honor for our program, and we are incredibly excited to have him. Please welcome John Elkington, founder and chief pollinator at Volance. John is one of the founders of the global sustainability movement, an experienced advisor to business, a highly regarded keynote speaker and contributor to conferences, the board of directors, and an inspirational figure to many of the people who we work with today. John's 20th book, Green Swans: The Coming Boom in Regenerative Capitalism, was published in 2020. Thank you so much for joining us today, John. For our attendees, please note that you can share thoughts with the forum and with John or all attendees through the chat function. You can also ask questions to the Q&A field, which we should have sufficient time to go through at the end of the event. And John, thank you again, and the screen is all yours.
Daniel and Rose, thank you very much indeed for the invitation, although I'm pretty sure that Sean Ansett and Paloma Lopez of Future Fit Foods had a hand in it as well, so thank you to them as well. And hello everyone. The forum sounds a great resource at what is actually quite a complicated time in all of our lives. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some slides, and then we'll open out and have a wider conversation. So if I can just try and pull up the slide deck. Daniel, can I just check that you can see those?
Not as yet, John. Depending on what slide you're on, it appears that you have a slide deck open, but I see a black screen.
That's fine. That's where we start, and then from there, can you see the swan?
Yes, sir.
Good. Well, I'll dive in then, and so a great privilege to be with the forum today. I'm going to talk about green swans. I'll explain in a moment what they are, at least in our minds. And I'll talk about a shift in the global economy over some decades towards what we're styling as the regenerative economy, but more of that shortly. And I'm in London, although as I was just saying to Daniel, today I've been in Helsinki, I've been in Paris, I've been in New York, and now here I am in Michigan. But you've gone through something of a watershed event recently, and I don't need to remind you of that. But it's an exciting period in politics. I think it's also a very challenging and potentially quite dangerous period in our collective politics. And so what I'm saying is within that context, but some of you will have seen just in the last couple of weeks, the World Resources Institute, WRI, publishing really interesting report on some of the challenges that we now face in relation to technologies, and particularly renewable and related technologies. And I'm not going to read out all of these different points, but if you look at the sort of the numbers of X or times jumps that we need to make in relatively short order to meet anything like a sensible global climate target, we really do face a formidable challenge. WRI talks about the need to accelerate the acceleration that's already underway. But I just want to make a simple point. I feel that the next 10 to 15 years are going to be by far the most exciting period in my working life to date, and I suspect in yours too. So let's just, Daniel very kindly introduced me, but let me just give you some discount factors to apply by talking a little bit about what brought me into this space. I started work in the early 1970s, initially running quite a major project in the Nile Delta in Egypt, shown here from space. And because of the things that I experienced there, I started writing. I wrote an article for New Scientist and then became a correspondent for them. And after a period of time of working with governments, I started to work with business. And in your neck of the woods, in the sort of Michigan area, I worked for a number of years with Bill Ford at Ford. And this was the early part of the century, although my then company, Sustainability, continued to work with Ford afterwards. And even at that time, you could already see this sort of bright speck on the horizon, Elon Musk and Tesla. And I've been quite struck in working with large companies to see how easy it is for them to miss those bright sort of specks on the horizon, things that over time will come to dominate their radar screens, their worlds. And when you think, it won't last, but Tesla being worth the equivalent of the 5 biggest auto companies globally, that's just one indication of the period in which we now find ourselves, which is a period, I believe, of massive disruption that has only just started. So I'm 71, I'm a baby boomer, for better or worse. I've been working since the early 70s. I've founded 4 social businesses, we'd now call them, since 1978. They all still exist. I've served on now almost 80 boards and advisory boards. And as Daniel kindly said, I've just published the 20th book. This is it. You'll notice that the subtitle is The Coming Boom in Regenerative Capitalism. And there's a story in there, and I'll come on to that at the moment. But one of the things, this came out in April of last year, and I've done something like 130 virtual keynotes in over 30 countries since then. And one standard question people have been asking is, like the book, like the case studies and so on, but I'm in this sector, I'm in this geography, these are my issues, my challenges, my opportunities, whatever. Can we have some case studies or information around that? So we're setting up an observatory, which will launch next month, which will initially look at cities, electricity, the whole food nexus, so soils, water, agriculture, food, nutrition, health, and so on, and money, the financial markets. And I'll touch on some of that just a little bit later. But just you remember that regenerative capitalism theme to the subtitle. And at the time, last April, I think a lot of people thought that was delusional, and it may still be. But in September of last year, many of you will remember, Doug McMillan, shown here, the CEO of Walmart, not my favorite company, but nonetheless a pretty major feature in the economic landscape, announced that Walmart was now committing itself to becoming a regenerative company. Now, we will all have different views of what regeneration might mean, as we have had over sustainability and sustainable and so on. But the fact that Paul Hawken, whose new book Regeneration comes out shortly, in September, helped write that speech, I think is an indication that there is serious intent there. And that's the front cover of Paul's impending book. So just a final couple of thoughts on who we are and where we fit into the landscape. We're a very small organization. We were founded in 2008. The two parent companies were Sustainability, which I co-founded back in 1987, and the World Economic Forum. We were the first UK B Corp, and we're based in Somerset House in London. Some of you will know that place. And it's an A to Z, but it's not a very full A to Z of clients and partners that we work with. So hopefully that'll give you some sense of where we fit into a wider landscape, but a very global business in many ways. And one of the themes I want to just raise today, and I saw Mark Carney was saying this yesterday, I think also, in relation to his new book, that the period of the Friedman agenda, which started pretty much 50 years ago with that editorial in the New York Times, and has had such a big influence on our wider world, is sort of drawing to an end. It doesn't mean that all of that thinking disappears, but a lot of it is now being questioned. And the question of whether you can just let markets rip and without very much thought to the consequences, I think increasingly looks suspect, to put it mildly. And I think you've got a very interesting range of voices now. Mark Benioff at Salesforce, Warren Buffett, others starting to say things like the Financial Times in my own country, saying, it's capitalism, it's time for a reset. Capitalism is broken. All of these various different formulations. But I did my first report on climate change back in 1978. For an extraordinary man, Herman Kahn of the Hudson Institute. And at the time, he chose not to believe what I was saying, which was by the early years of the 21st century, climate change would be coming screaming up the agenda. We can talk about that in discussion if you want, but I think he opposed the notion of climate change for largely ideological reasons, but had a very good formulation for what we might do if it did turn out to be reality. Well, it's turned out to be a very striking emergent reality, whether you go to Brazil, whether you go to California, whether you go to Australia, different parts of the world are experiencing climate chaos increasingly. And because of that sort of emergent set of issues, a couple of years ago, several of you might know, I did a product recall of the triple bottom line. So that notion I came up with in 1994, 1995, I launched the People, Planet, Profit formulation. I launched that product recall, which is a sort of a concept that I learned from working with people like Ford and Toyota and so on. More or less as sort of an exercise in sort of Zen Buddhism, to say to people, are we really sure that using this concept is the road to true sustainability? I think it's really helpful. I think it's served all sorts of useful ends in this space. But I had increasingly seen people trading off, we'll do this bit and we'll do that bit. It's shame about that bit over there. It was that sort of, it wasn't an integrated approach. And the cartoon there, some of you may have seen me use that before, but it tracks back to 1991. And I got a Financial Times cartoonist, Ingram Pinn, still brilliant cartoonist for the FT, to do this for me. And the idea was that any boardroom table, any C-suite really needed different voices at the table, in addition to all of the conventional roles: a voice for nature, a voice for the social agenda, and critically, a voice for the longer term, and the robot was meant to represent that. As it happened, the recall was quite well received and was very quickly followed. I'm not claiming any agency here. I mean, part of what I do is to pick up on emergent trends and try and spotlight them and ride them for a while. But this was the Financial Times front cover that came out early 2019, I think it was. And again, the signal was, thank you, Milton Friedman, but times are moving on. And some of you, again, will have seen the New York Times leader or editorial, which came out pretty much, or op-ed, it came out at the same time, 50 years on from the original Friedman one in the New York Times. And I won't go through all of these because many of you will have seen the full page ads and the other materials that came out from this sort of collective Imperative 21. I just want to point you at the bottom row in the middle, the green poster around a need to shift from extractive to regenerative. Well, it's easy to say that, but part of the question I'm going to raise is, what does that regenerative agenda really look like? And all of this is happening, again, at an extraordinary moment in our collective history where things are starting to go exponential in ways that many of us haven't properly experienced. Now, the COVID-19, the pandemic, has gone exponential and taken us ways in directions we really don't want to travel. But if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, this is something I routinely say to companies or have done as they start to work through what they're doing around the 17 goals and the 169 targets. And often the game is, what are we already doing, and how does that map onto the SDGs? And I think, well, it's an entertaining party game, but actually it's not really what we need to be doing. And if they just bothered to spend a moment looking at just the first two goals, no poverty and zero hunger by 2030, those are not incremental goals. We're not going to creep up towards those and achieve them. These are system change goals. They need us to think differently, behave differently, invest differently. And if we're governments, do government differently as well. One of the people in the midst of all of this who's had quite a big impact on my thinking and over quite a long time is Nassim Nicholas Taleb, shown here. And some of you will have read his book, The Black Swan. It came out in 2007, just ahead of the market crash. And many people thought that he was prophesying it and so on. His point was slightly different, that every so often, but increasingly, there are these black swan events that come along, and they come out of the blue. They take us completely by surprise. They have an off-the-scale impact, which we have no reason to expect that they would have when they start to happen. You think about COVID-19. And after the event, we sit down and try and work out what's just happened to us and find that we think we know what's happened, but actually we very often misinterpret, which means that we set ourselves up to fail again. Now, many of you will again have heard Taleb being constantly asked, and was COVID-19 a black swan? And his answer, you will probably know, was no, because we saw it coming. We predicted pandemics, we predicted coronavirus pandemics. And just unfortunately, what very often happened was that the governments who commissioned the work then chose to ignore the virus or the risk of a pandemic and look at the consequences, look at the cost. And I think some of the consequences of this will take decades to properly show through. And again, Singularity University has been very much in the spotlight for several years now. And this is one of the diagrams I love from the work that they've done. And it's just a simple point that our brains are not terribly well configured to deal with exponentials. We ignore these exponential trends for quite a long time until they explode all around us, by which point it's actually rather late in the day. And just to take one example, a rather obvious one, Greta Thunberg, the way in which she exploded from nowhere, a 15-year-old, and was then talking to CEOs in Davos, talking to the UN General Assembly. That sort of trajectory, that sort of exponential emergence I think is not an accident. I think it's very much part of the world into which we're moving. And I don't think that's going to end very quickly. I don't think in 4 years we'll see an end to that. I think this is a characteristic of the sort of processes of change that we're about to go through. Now, let me just very quickly dig into the Green Swan story. People often ask, so what is a green swan? And I give a number of examples, but one of them, and that I won't read out the definitions on the right, but one of them is the European Union's Green Deal. So that's 1.82 trillion euros worth of funding, fought over, contested, all the rest of it, but now cranking along, being put into building back better, but building back better in an inclusive, socially inclusive, and cleaner, greener way. So suddenly you're starting to see the sort of the sustainable development agenda coming right into the center of government policy. And with the Biden-Harris administration now in the United States, you've got very much the similar trend. This is a massive experiment. We really don't know how this is going to play out. Will it be a rerun of the New Deal period in the United States? I don't know, but I think it's the level of action which we now need to see in the world. Now, happily, some of the trends in technology in particular are going very much in our favor. So you will all have seen trends, projections like this. This is obviously solar, but you see the same trends in wind. You see them in battery technology. And the gray bar, or the gray line, the zone across the middle there, is the cost ranges of fossil power plants that have already been built. And so what you see is over the period of the Sustainable Development Goals and beyond, renewable energy is going to become radically cheaper. And this is a very major shock to business as usual. We can discuss where that will take us. But that for us is one of a number of trends that we see as really quite encouraging. Now, for every green swan, there will be black feathers, if you like, in the sense that we'll do a lot of stuff to invest and build out the renewable energy economy. And then we'll find that there was the stuff that we didn't think about. There'll be unintended consequences. And so, for example, the rotors, the propellers, the vanes of these wind mills or aerogenerators or whatever we call them, turn out not to be recyclable. So people are starting to play all sorts of merry games now. Can we turn them into telephone poles or whatever else? But this is a fairly major quantity of materials, which we really should have thought about closing the loop on, bringing back into the circular economy. But for whatever reason at the time, either we didn't, or if people did, their views were overruled. One of the things that gives me greatest hope is young people. And I'm not trying to say, you know, as boomers, we screwed up. We tried to be environmentalists. We didn't really make that work. So over to you lot to sort it out. Instead, what I'm saying, we are now embarking on a pan-generational challenge and a pan-generational experiment. And all of the generations have to work together in a way that is almost unparalleled. It certainly happens in wars periodically, but not always. And an example of the way in which this is playing through in some of the work that we do is Acciona, who are a Madrid-based global infrastructure and renewable energy company, largely family-owned. And we spent last year working with 27 of their young fast-track executives from around the world. And we started off, the commission was, come in and help us develop a 5-year sustainability strategy. And Acciona has been a leader in that for quite some time. It ended up as a 10-year strategy for the group as a whole, by request of the top team. And just working with those younger people persuaded me of one thing. We've got to get younger people into every level in our societies sooner than would once have been the case. Now, I don't mean by that they will get everything right. Of course they won't, but they're going to have to make mistakes as we did, and they're going to have to make them faster and learn more effectively from all of that. But I do think bringing younger people into every level of decision making is now absolutely crucial. And I mentioned the Green Swans Observatory launches next month. And these are the 4 sectors that we're focusing on. And we're working now with Paul Hawken, who I mentioned, and a guy in Australia called Damon Gamo, to develop a global database of regenerators, people doing practical work on different forms of regeneration, environmental, of course, agricultural, of course, but economic, social, political, and so on, and hopefully very often integrated. And this is pretty much the final slide. And it's just, many of you probably will have come across McKinsey's 3 Horizons model. There are other ones out there, which are very often consecutive S-curves. We have a 3 Horizons model, and it's based on the work of somebody called Bill Sharp. It's slightly different. And it's basically almost like a series of paradigm shifts. So not just driven by technology. And the data points on these different curves have been provided by a series of companies and one regulatory EPA authority that we've worked with. The sort of the starting top line, the sort of violet or purple line, is the world we've all grown up in. It's a world that was shaped very forcefully by Bretton Woods, by the Marshall Plan in certain parts of the world, and a UN system that emerged out of that with all sorts of other institutions in tow. It's fading, it's breaking apart, it's going. We may not like to recognize that, but we're moving towards a period of extreme agitation in the global system. And it's a period where those UN structures are no longer, at least in my view, fit for purpose. Now, in the longer term, and this is the blue line that starts at the bottom, and all of these realities are, at any one point, they're all in existence. They're all present in our reality if we can see them. That blue line is heading to a very different future, and it's a future where the circular economy and renewable energy and all of these different aspects of our thought models and so on. For example, GDP and economics, they've got to be fundamentally transformed. They will be transformed. Question is by whom and over what sort of time scale. And the middle, that's where most of us are going to do most of our useful work. And I'm speaking mainly to people a lot younger than me. It's a period where we're in transition. We're working with a number of companies that are going through, true processes of transformation. And it's grueling, it's exciting, but it's a pretty tough set of challenges. And I think over time, we'll see the current focus on responsibility, CSR and all that good stuff, human rights, and that agenda is expanding. So we're now talking about wealth divides. We're talking about public access to healthcare. We're talking about tax avoidance and tax havens. These are new elements of the responsibility agenda. But if you listen to politicians and you listen to CEOs and you listen to investors, what many of them are now talking about is resilience, individual resilience, team resilience, organizational, the national economy level, and then the global level and the biosphere. Resilience is increasingly on people's minds and tongues. And the problem is with resilience is you don't get there simply by putting your hands together and devoutly wishing. You get there by investment over a long period of time. You get there by regenerating the systems on which your well-being depends. Again, economic, social, political, and environmental. Now, some of you may have read into that a sense that I'm gloomy. I'm not. I actually think we are in a dark time in so many different ways. And yet that's exactly the sort of moment where in our history, our species have been backed into a corner and then exploded out with new solutions. So I'm incredibly excited about what comes next, but I don't think any of this is a given. It depends on us all to make it real, to make it happen, and make it happen in an effective and efficient and inclusive way. And again, I think that's what your new administration is very much pushing for as well. So Daniel, if I may, I'll stop there, hand back to you, and happily join in any sort of discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think I learned a good bit during during that time, and I know both Rose and myself have picked up the book, or are waiting for it to arrive in the mail at least, and are looking forward to learning more. Uh, One item I wanted to ask of my own before we start digging
Yeah.
into the questions, and again, for those who are listening or watching, if you'd like to drop any questions you have into the Q&A tool or on the chats, we'll be going through those in a moment here. Uh, Talking about the recall of the term triple bottom line, our organization recently took that out of our mission statement as well, so we can adopt something that is more prescriptive to the change that we're looking to forward as an organization and within the programs that we develop. Uh, but we still use the phrase triple bottom line, or the triple bottom
Yeah.
line model for
Yeah.
sustainable, for beyond compliance sustainability, or variations of that. And often when we talk about these concepts and in our marketing and so on, as we feel like it does have some usefulness and utility, especially uh, when communicating to certain audiences. The uh, how do you feel about the continued use for it? And is, when you say the recall, is that should that be considered a condemnation, or more of a build upon moment?
um, I'm not a Zen Buddhist, but they have this term koan, which is something that sort of is almost like a whack to the head to make you think differently. And some of you will know of the new book, Think Again. I recommend it very highly. But it was an attempt to just say, are we really sure about this? The Harvard Business Review said it was the first time in their knowledge that any management concept had been recalled. But anyone who understands recalls know that they're actually an attempt to say, there is a defect in this concept. We're going to pull it back, and then we're going to relaunch it, or we're going to put it back into the market. So I think the triple bottom line is perfectly good language. When it came out, it was pretty much on its own. And then you had the double bottom line and all sorts of ideas of what a quadruple bottom line and shared value and blended value and ESG and all of these different approaches come through. And they all have their utility and value. But the way we're seeing it is that the triple bottom line works if you expand the spotlight from the responsibility agenda, which is where pretty much all of the work on TBL, whatever, has been done, through the resilience phase to regeneration. And you start to think about different dimensions of value creation in the regeneration space. That's fine. I mean, absolutely. And a lot of people who have used it for a while have not exactly pleaded for its sort of restoration or whatever, but basically say, please make a similar scale announcement. I'm talking to Mark McElroy, who some of you will know, the multi-capital scorecard background. And I'm starting to work with some of these people saying, how do we later this year relaunch it? But I use the triple bottom lines more than I did, say, 2 years ago, because I now I'm slightly more confident that I know what I'm talking about and how it might be better used.
So I'm going to read off some of the questions here, because most
Yeah.
people can't see them. I'm going to read them in total. First one is from Joe Campbell. What personality characteristics are important to embody to be an effective Green Swan? I am an academic, but I work regularly with businesses, NGOs, community activists, etc., often trying to get those sectors to come together in community sustainability issues.
Yeah.
I receive comments, especially from private sector actors, that to be effective, one must be highly selfish and quote unquote mean, because that is the real world. Is there a pathway forward for broader openness, communication, honesty, and transparency in this field? What does the personal pivot from net worth to well-being look like?
It's a very interesting question. I think we could spend sort of several weeks answering it. But thank you, Joe. I've watched companies go through their think about Microsoft and Netscape and the brutality of Microsoft and its growth phase. And then you get to the point where Bill Gates has his foundation, and philanthropy is pouring out of the organization or parallel organizations. I think a very interesting transition is happening here, where if you go back to the period of Rockefeller and Carnegie, people were cruel, merciless throughout their working career until they were about to die. And then, the legacy thing switched in, or they didn't spend a lot of their money, and therefore there was a lot of money suddenly to be dispersed, and that was put through foundations. And now, as we know, people are doing it much earlier in their life. But I still think that's the wrong model of capitalism. It doesn't mean that if you go to Saudi Arabia, I've worked there. It doesn't mean if you go to India or China, and I've worked both those countries quite a lot, you won't see pretty rapacious, voracious forms of capitalism. You will. And very often, some of those will succeed. So, people will conclude from that was the right way to go. But I think and just very quickly, to us, a green swan is not an individual. We've got people putting green swan on their business cards in places like the Philippines and Indonesia and so on. And we just say, well, that's very nice. But what we mean by a green swan is the market shift. It's a political shift. It's a cultural shift. So you can play into that, but you're not necessarily yourself a green swan. A company can be playing into a green swan market trajectory, and that is great. We also talk about ugly ducklings, so things in today's world that look seriously weird and would be laughed out of existence, a bit like Elon's Tesla, but 15 years back. And that over time, these things can come to dominate the landscape. To your question, I think several things. One is curiosity. I think one of the things that people inside whatever sort of business need to do is get out more. Very often what people do is in the stakeholder engagement mode, the business roundtable, encouraging everyone to do that now, is to get the outside world in. Well, that's a nice start, but actually I think we've got to get outside. We've got to go and look at the places where the future is already bubbling up, engage those people, and then come back into our organizations with some of that new knowledge. And some of that stuff is actually in young people, their experience, their thinking, their ambitions. And therefore engaging younger people in your own organization, absolutely critical. And just finally, a couple of companies that we're working with are now toying with the idea of youth boards, where they would have parallel boards, but made up of much younger people, both from inside and outside the company. I think that's another way to go too. But thanks for the question, Joe.
Here we have one from Sean Ansett, and again I neglected to thank Sean and Paloma for facilitating that for facilitating this this connection. Again, thank you, Sean and Paloma of Future Fit Foods, for making this happen. John, one of the biggest challenges we face through regeneration is shifting from a largely linear and heavily subsidized economic system, e.g. the economy grows when a tree is harvested. What is the best way to influence much-seen policy changes to enable a regenerative economy? And if time permits, should we place our bets on traditional incumbent businesses or emerging impact businesses?
That's interesting, isn't it? Because, I remember having a stand-up row about 12, 15 years ago with Rex Tillerson when he was CEO of ExxonMobil, all powerful. I mean, I was on stage in Norway and Stavanger talking to a whole set of oil people. I was saying that Exxon, in particular ExxonMobil, were corrupting the political process on climate science. Tillerson walked into the back of the room and basically howled across 300 people's heads. And that's a goddamn lie. 2 weeks later, the New York State court case broke. Now, you've suddenly seen ExxonMobil lose 40% of its value. I'm not crowing. I'm just simply saying that the fossil fuels industry, it's done great service. We wouldn't be where we are now without what they've managed to do over time. But we've got to get rid of that industry as fast as we possibly can. So, we can talk about circular economy. We can talk about these different concepts. We can talk about the need to renew understanding of economics. And suddenly you're starting to get some really interesting economists coming up. It used to be people like Joe Stiglitz. It's now people like Kate Rayworth and Mariana Mazzucato and so on. So it's late in the day and it's still somewhat on the margins, but I think economics is beginning to evolve. Thank God. Concepts like GNP and GDP and all the rest of it have been talked about, gross happiness indexes and all of that good stuff. But I think in very short order, by which I mean 8 to 10 years, we're going to see economics go through a convulsive period of enforced learning in some ways. And part of that will be the shift from linear to circular, and some of it will be degenerative to regenerative, and everyone will have their own terms. It'll be net zero or carbon friendly or climate friendly or whatever it happens to be. I think we need a radical shakedown of language in this space as well. But I'm actually optimistic. I think we're in a paradigm shift. Paradigm shifts, Thomas Kuhn said back in the early 60s when he introduced the idea, they take about 70 to 80 years because they need the people who were infected with the old paradigm to either die or retire, and then the generation that they taught to go get out of the way as well. And I think we're now something like 70 years into this process. So the next 10 years are going to see that paradigm go almost like an iceberg turning over. And that's going to be shocking for people. I mean, Appalachian miners or whoever it happens to be, this is going to be a real insult to their sense of identity and so on. And unless governments can properly understand that and wade in and get involved in transitional strategies and funding, this is going to be a lot harder than it needs to be. So, Sean, thanks for the question, but I think you're very much with Future Fit Foods playing into that new order.
John, I have a question from Carrie Bliss of Padnos. Some of the sustainability initiatives I'm working on have a 5 to 10 year return on investments.
Yeah.
Do you have any suggestions on help the C-suites of, especially of a medium-sized business, understand the importance of shorter term, the importance of this over shorter term payoffs?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's this age-old issue of how do you persuade somebody whose future well-being, as they define it, depends on not listening to you. And I think that has been for a very long period of time true in corporate C-suites that we've dealt with. But I've seen a very significant shift in maybe the last 3 to 4 years. And this isn't the first of these shifts. They come in a series of waves, structures in a way. And the shift is this: people increasingly know change is coming, but they don't want to address it on their watch because the incentives that they're operating to don't reward them for doing the right thing. And so that sort of almost existential angst, if I can put it like that, in individuals will grow over time. And I give you one example. I mean, I was recently with a German company, chemical and materials company, and they were being a little bit difficult, and then I went and had lunch or breakfast with some of their directors, and 2 of the directors said the same thing to me quite independently, which was their children were now going out on climate strikes, and there is this sort of almost separation within families of the different agendas. So young people now see climate chaos, the climate emergency, whatever we call it, as bearing in on their futures at a time when many other things are bearing in on their futures as well. So, no, I'm not delusional. I don't think. I don't believe that most C-suite players will move against their perceived short-term interests just because we want them to do it. But I think most of these people are intelligent. Most of them can see that this agenda is now coming at us like what they used to call a Mack truck. I mean, it's coming at us so powerfully, so fast, so hard, in different parts of the world, of course. And yet the odd thing is you talk to companies and you survey them and you ask them what their top priority is. Climate change comes down to about number 8, number 9, the last survey I saw. So collectively, we're sort of being a little bit blind. But individuals are starting to sort of pay a lot more attention. And I think we just got to work with those and spotlight what people like Tesla are doing, which is just upending one industry after another. Final point on that one. If you haven't seen the work of Rethink X, based both in Silicon Valley and London, I recommend it really, really highly. So what Rethink X have done is to look at the impact of disruptive technologies, first on transportation and mobility. So the whole sort of Detroit complex is going to go through the grinder. The second one is cattle ranching and dairying. The first one was global. Second one was US only. And the most recent one is on energy. And in every case, what they're concluding is that the scale of the disruption, the scale of the job losses are going to be absolutely critical in terms of political outcomes and so on. So I think we're at an immensely interesting time, but the question is, how do leaders step up and do the right things? And we have to incentivize them. If we don't, if governments don't penalize people for doing the wrong thing and reward them for doing the right thing, how can we blame them if they don't act?
Thank you, John. We have a question. Our next question is from Fred Keller, most recently of Cascade Engineering.
Yes.
As you think about B Corp, the B Team, inclusive capitalism, compassionate capitalism, and all the others, do you see some coalescing of these business initiatives? Do you think that is as essential, or is it better to have several approaches?
Well, I'll probably say something that offends somebody at some stage in the process, but many years ago, 30 years ago, people in business used to beat me up and say, why can't all these environmental and green groups and human rights groups get together? And I said, well, I don't think the Vatican is the best model of engagement around the world. Now it's improved over time, no doubt, but and I don't think that having everyone under the same roof is always the best way forward. But we've got to a Tower of Babel moment where there are so many different catechisms and languages and targets and so on out there. It's becoming very confusing for those people who want to be confused. It's a wonderful alibi, just saying, go away and get yourself sorted out and then come back and tell us precisely what you want. And one of my calls earlier on today, two of them, in fact, were on exactly that point. But I do think that there's a need to come together. I think that we're beginning to see that Imperative 21, which I mentioned with that New York Times full-page ad, is one example in which, in that case, something like 300 organizations, including our own, came together. And the B Corporation movement, I think, is fantastic. But what you will see over time is, say, that I love B Lab, and I'm doing a session for them within a week or two. But we've just gone through, I think, the third or fourth round of the B Lab assessment that we've done. And our score has been progressively coming down and down and down because their focus increasingly is on bigger companies. And so they're ranking and scoring things that big companies can do and small ones really struggle with. Now, that is sort of an inevitable part of perhaps maturation, but actually I think it's another reason why over time B Lab itself will come under competitive pressure from other people. So I don't think we're going to get rid of that almost speciation sort of trend where you get individuals setting up like Greta did, Fridays for Future. Who would have thought? And yet that's now a worldwide movement, particularly of young people. So let's come together, but let's also recognize that in diversity, there is health. In diversity, there is the potential of collaboration and competition at the same time. And that, I grew up in 60s London, where the bands and musical bands are all competing, and that produced a better outcome. And so, simple answer, let's have both. Let's have the diversity, but actually come together where it makes sense to do so and really focus. And it's going to make it's going to make sense to focus with COP26 on the horizon in November in Glasgow, at least on the climate front.
Thank you, John. And I appreciated how you found a way to use the Beatles and the Rolling Stones as a way to support that point. Yeah, I've got a question from Craig Ladyman of Pratt, and I'll confess he's using some terminology that I'm not familiar with here. How will distributed ledger technology affect this exponential decade? Is that something that you're familiar to prepared to speak to?
Yes, I think I can begin to talk to that. So, I mean, technology is going in a direction where quite a number of people are now excited about the way in which accounting mechanisms could be non-crackable and hold levels of information that we can only just begin to dream about at the moment. And I think longer term, that's both a need, a necessity, and therefore will happen. But we're in the hype curve where people are seeing some of this stuff coming through actually rather faster than I think it will do. But the question that I like to ask people is, what would it be like if money could think? And at the moment, money sort of thinks by financial institutions and analysts and investors and so on, doing what they do. But what if money had a memory? What if money could actually keep track over time of the ways in which it had been used? And you know, almost down to the individual coin. Remember of the sort of the times when it's done good, however you define that, the times when it's not been quite so beneficial. And that seems a complete stretch. And you should be warned. I mean, I read quite a lot of science fiction. But the interesting thing about science fiction is very often the ideas that look outlandish, back to the ugly ducklings, you know, for one generation, become absolutely taken for granted, ho-hum for the next generation. So technology is moving in the direction where our corporate and collective memory will be accessible in ways that are almost unimaginable at the moment. They'll also be accessible to regulators, and if we're not careful, to hackers and all the rest of it. But no, I think we will see very big jumps in that area. And again, critically, because we need those breakthroughs. We need to know what's happening right the way through global supply chains. I just came off another call with EcoVadis in Paris, and you know what they've done. When I joined them, they were about 14 people, and something like 700 in over a dozen countries, and they're working with tens of thousands of companies. And that's trying to open up supply chains. It's trying to understand what's happening in human rights and climate change and biodiversity and all these different things. That's only the very beginning of all of this, until accounting and until money and finance really sort of wakes up to all this stuff properly and develops a really effective memory and set of controls procedures. We're still going to be at the stage of waddling along rather than flying.
John, I'm going to condense a few different questions into into one here. Can you speak to the relationship between the current economic system and capitalism and white supremacy?
It's interesting. Now, I think supremacies of all sorts have always been in our societies. Very often they're like opportunistic viruses, and as long as things are progressing and people can broadly sense that, they're sort of held under control. There's almost an equivalent of a political or a sort of cultural immune system. We're going through a period of intense stress, which can only get, in many ways, worse. People sense that. I remember, even when I was working with Bill Ford, going through airports in Detroit and elsewhere in the area, and being twice stopped, pulled out of line, stuck in a glass cage, and interrogated. And the question routinely was, why are you here? I'm here to work with Ford. Why are you working with Ford? Why can't that be done with Americans? Now, it didn't help then to say, have you heard of globalization or anything like that? But nonetheless, blue-collar workers, if I can use the phrase, sensed in their bones that the old order was failing. And that drives a very different set of politics. So, for example, when you look at that Rethink X study on cattle ranching, one of the predictions is that within about 15 to 20 years, there will be 60% fewer head of cattle on US farms. I mean, even if you said it was only 10%, that's going to be a really, really big hammer blow to an industry that very often works on relatively tight margins. Why? Not because people are deciding not to eat meat. It's because of precision fermentation. There are new technologies coming up very rapidly, which enable you to do anything that a cow does and do it quite a lot better. And because of the technology, the costs will come screaming down over time. So it's, again, I think, unless we prepare people, and this goes right back to education at every level, prepare for the fact that we're in for a period of several decades, possibly even a generation or two, where things just shake down into a very different set of patterns, and try and help people negotiate those shockwaves. I think we're gonna suffer a lot of political pushback. And just finally, just last night, I was reading a paper that was done by David Brin, the science fiction author, to a group of people working on artificial intelligence in California. And he was basically warning them that if they go their current trajectory of, basically, as he put it, designing God, with their expert systems and all the rest of it, what's gonna happen to them is equivalent to what happened in the Renaissance, the Middle Ages and so on, in places like Italy, where people quite literally for their science got burned at the stake or put in prison or silenced. And you know, we're very close to that sort of reaction against the leading edge of technology, the leading edge of science as well. So simple answer, I don't know what to do about it, except I do think, I think with Biden and Harris, you've now got people who are legitimate with some parts of wider society, but not necessarily with that sort of the white supremacist groups. And in fact, I think Trump has now so agitated them and stirred them up. Sorry, I'm going political here, but I think this is not just an American problem. I think it is a problem in my own country and many different parts of the world. You look at Brazil and you look at Turkey and you look wherever you go, China and India, you've got the same problems. But we're going to have to act, and we're going to have to sort of tell people certain types of behavior are not acceptable, and we're going to shut you down. Whatever that means, we're going to shut you down. Now, that's going to be akin to a civil war in some ways in some parts of the world. The question is that going to happen? And if case, in what form will it present itself? I think in the United States, it started some time ago. And I think it's going to be challenging, but in the same way that in the 1860s, that war shaped America for well over a century afterwards. There's something breaking loose now, which I think is going to have the same effect, for better or worse. Sorry, that's a lot more than you asked for, but
well, it's a fairly loaded question, to be fair. and we do have a lot of great questions that we're not going to get a chance to get to today. Apologize to everyone whose question we did not get to. We tried to answer them in approximate order they came in, and just a lot of fascinating discussion here. I want to thank John again for taking his time to be with us today. Please, everyone, consider checking out Green Swans or any of John's other 19 books. We do have a link to that in the chat, and we'll be sending that along as well in the follow-up materials. If you're interested in joining us for our networking hour, you'll find a link to that in the chat presently as well from Rose Spickler, as well as a link to our next event in April. Again, thank you so much, John. If you have any final words, this is our program for today.
No, I apologize for not getting, firstly, holding my answers, keeping them shorter and missing some of the questions.
Complaints.
Thanks for all the questions people have pitched in. Good luck with it all. And again, just to end on a positive note, I think the period of time ahead of us, the exponential decade or whatever we call us, is where we will be tested. It'll be character forming in the extreme at times. But one of the things that gives me huge hope is the way that a forum like this pulls together people from quite disparate necks of the wood, and the way in which now younger people are waking up to this, all of this. I think that's our greatest hope, because but we've got to keep them positive. We've got to keep them moving forward. If they become radicalized and so on, that will be a nightmare. So good luck to us all, and look forward to hearing how the forum evolves over time. But Daniel and Rose, again, thanks very much for the invitation.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
Thank you. Goodbye all.